they couldn't adjust, and they stagnated. So, I mean, I think all three outcomes are possible, and we can't be sanguine. But I think the most likely outcome, for the reasons that I've outlined, is that the government does do enough in structural reforms. We do see a relatively smooth transition to a new growth path, and then the world has to deal with a continuing growth story out of China, but a very different kind of growth than we've seen in the past. So I think I'll stop there, and we can open up for questions for probably about 15 or 20 minutes. And I don't know, Ambassador, would you like to have the honor of the first question?
Yes, sure. I have the right, first of all, to thank you very much for your very good presentation. Very comprehensive. I have more than questions. I have two doubts concerning 2 points you mentioned. One is that the debt of the non-financial sector is around 200%, 210% of GDP. What's the debt of the financial sector? And this quite big debt of 210% of GDP, where does it come from? Perhaps I ask the second question right now.
Okay, sure.
The second question has to do with what I understood. It's an offer of jobs which is much larger than the demand. So if this happens, of course, there is a competition for jobs, and you may have a substantial increase in wages. And this substantial increase in wages, which is already to be seen in some sectors, may affect Chinese exports. What is the impact of this increase in wages on prices of exports right now? Which are the sectors and what is the prospect?
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so on the first question, on the debt question, the reason we look at non-financial debt is that's the standard way of looking at it across economies, because basically the job of financial companies is to take on a lot of debt and to issue a lot of debt. They're intermediaries. So the risk of counting financial debt is that you're essentially double counting. So what you really want to understand is where is debt going in the real economy, and is that financing productive activity or not? And that is your second question. Where's all that debt going? Well, of that 200% of GDP, about 35% is going to households mainly to finance mortgages. And that's basically, pretty safe. China is a place where people are very conservative. Households do not tend to borrow a lot. The average house purchase in China is made with a loan of about 40 to 50% of the value of the house. So the mortgage, the household component is, I think, pretty safe. About 100% is to corporations, and that, is everything from, state-owned enterprises in the aviation or petrochemical sectors down to private companies selling consumer goods. We're not terribly concerned about that. That's a relatively high level, but there are other countries like Korea and Germany that also have pretty high levels of corporate debt. And the change in the ratio of corporate debt has not been so extreme. So that's a little bit concerning, but not a big red flag yet. The big concern is in the 65% of the debt that's held by government entities. And when you divide that up, about 25% of GDP represents borrowing by the central government, which is a very low level. Most countries' central governments have much higher debt ratios. So at the central government ratio level, China looks fine. The real problem is at the local government level, because about 40% of GDP represents borrowings by local governments, not directly because they're prohibited by law from borrowing, But what local governments do is they set up companies which usually borrow from banks to construct infrastructure, and the collateral is land. And the question is, what's the value that has been assigned to that collateral? Okay. And there's a concern that the land values are not appropriate. So the big question mark and the big problem in that debt is the debts of the local governments. And I think that's going to be a big problem that's going to take them several years to work out how to, and again, I alluded to some of the fiscal problems of local governments. They're not well financed. Broadly, however, I would say that more than not, the debt in China goes to productive investments and not to wasteful investments. So it's a high debt level, but it's debt that's financing stuff that is producing some kind of an economic return. On your question on the labor market and the impact of rising wages on Chinese exports and export prices, I think what we've seen so far is that in some of the more labor-intensive, low-value-added sectors like textiles and shoes, China has started to lose some of this activity to countries in Southeast Asia like Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and so forth. It has not had much impact on China's ability to continue exporting higher value-added goods. I think in certain categories of very, very high-value goods, particularly where it's possible to automate at reasonable cost, we have seen a trend of some multinationals, particularly U.S. multinationals, relocating some of their production from labor-intensive factories in China to automated factories in the United States. But that's still a relatively small phenomenon. It's attracted a lot of press, but I think in terms of the absolute numbers, it's fairly small. Fundamentally, I think China is still a very competitive export economy, so, and a lot of that competitiveness derives from the infrastructure and economies of scale. So even if labor costs rise, I think China will continue to be a very vibrant exporter. I think the other concern that people have is that if the prices of Chinese exports rise, that could have an impact on global prices, and that China could start to export inflation. And I think that's extremely, extremely unlikely because, we've had central banks in the U.S. and Europe and Japan keeping interest rates at zero for the last 5 years. And despite many people saying, oh, this is going to generate gigantic inflation, nothing has happened. So we are in a profoundly deflationary stage of the global economy with central banks doing everything they can to push prices up. They haven't been able to do that. In that context, a 10% increase in Chinese labor costs is not going to have a material impact on global prices.
Okay, thank you. Now we open to the floor. You first, then Norman.
Okay. Nicola Chingas from the Brazilian Association of Financial Institutions for Consumer Credit. As I understand from your view, China shift of the economic model will put a cap from 11% growth to 7% growth, which is still the double of the world growth this year according to the IMF, which is good. But I understand also that this depends on increasing productivity, because this will be key, first, to accommodate the amortization of the debt and the financial trap, and second, this would reduce costs and help inflation. Okay, productivity, if China will grow 7% with these structural reforms, will be a good bet. But the question is, first, we have some political constraints you mentioned, but also in this scenario, it's very likely that China goes on. So what could be the Achilles heel of this scenario? That's the question.
What could be
the Achilles heel, or the vulnerability of this scenario, okay?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think the basic risk here is that the government decides that the structural reform agenda is just too difficult and that the opposition is too great. And that's a significant risk. I mean, as I've said, one of the key issues that the government has to tackle is reducing the role of state-owned enterprises. Now, I think if you go to the state-owned enterprises, they will probably not agree that their role should be reduced. 15 years ago, when they did a round of state-owned enterprises reform, the state-owned enterprises were all bankrupt, so they couldn't argue with reform because they had nothing to show for themselves. Now they've had 10 or 12 years of very extensive growth. Even though their efficiency is low, because their scale is so large, they have enormous cash flows. They are very rich. They control huge key sectors of the economy, and they can mount a very powerful argument that it's a dangerous thing to reduce their role. And they can buy a lot of support because they have a lot of money. So it's a very, very difficult job for the government to, on a large scale, reduce the role of the state-owned enterprises. And if they don't do that, that won't, cause the economy to tank this year or next year. But, 3, 4, 5 years down the road, the efficiency losses will pile up and you'll have a big problem. So I think the single biggest risk is that they are unable to restructure the productive sector of the economy. I think the second risk is that they get tempted one more time to deal with an economic downturn by increasing credit, because it's worked before, and yeah, we can probably get away with it one more time, right? And this will be the last time for sure, right? It's very easy to see them doing something like that. And then you could they could easily wind up in some kind of a credit bubble or a debt trap. So I think those are the two risks, and they're both, they're not small risks, they're large risks.
Nom. De microphone.
Two brief questions, Arthur. First of all, what is the capital output ratio in the Chinese economy? In what direction is it moving? The second question is, how serious do you think politically is the hacking, the cyber warfare conflict with the United States?
The quick answer to the capital output ratio is I'm not sure I know. I think a lot of the discussion, first of all, it's a little bit difficult to measure the capital output ratio appropriately unless you do a calculation of the capital stock. I think what I can say is that directionally, the capital output ratio has been rising, which is not a good thing. In other words, for each unit of output, you have to throw more and more capital in. So I think there is, over the last 2 or 3 years, there's clearly been an increase in the credit intensity. So again, for each dollar of credit that you throw into the economy, you get less and less growth. I think that's true for capital. So I think that the important point is that directionally, the credit intensity and the capital output ratio are going the wrong way right now. It's not dire, but you need to change the direction. On the cyber warfare question, that is, I think, an interesting one. There's been a lot of press, as many of you know, about Chinese hacking into the networks of U.S. corporations and U.S. government entities. And a lot of this activity has been traced to basically the Chinese army. I think it's a very serious issue in terms of the bilateral relationship. I think, from a sort of a remove, one has to ask, well, we know because the New York Times has written about it, what the Chinese are doing to the U.S., what is the National Security Agency of the United States doing to Chinese entities? Probably at least as much, if not more, but somehow we don't hear about that. So I'm a little bit reluctant to get too moralistic about it. But what I think is clear is that it's become a big issue. I think the characteristic of the Chinese hacking is that it's not just the Chinese trying to spy on the U.S. government, but a lot of it is commercial related, and I think there are large concerns and legitimate concerns in the U.S. that large government resources in China are being devoted to theft of commercial secrets and technology from U.S. companies. So I think where this comes from is that, if you look at Chinese military strategy, they're not really expansionary, but they do want to have a little bit of freedom of action within their own region, particularly as regards Taiwan. The main obstruction to their freedom of action is a powerful U.S. military. The Chinese know that they can never compete head-to-head with the U.S. military. They're just too far behind. So what they want to do is they want to engage in what's called asymmetric warfare to be able, if for example, the Chinese decide they want to invade Taiwan, they want to deter the United States from intervening. And the way that they can do that is by making the cost of that intervention very high by saying, okay, well, if you intervene in Taiwan, we'll knock out half of your power grid for 10 days because we have hacked into your electricity grid networks. And that would make the U.S. think twice about coming to the aid of Taiwan. I think that's basically what is behind a lot of this. It's a very sensible strategy from the Chinese point of view. But there's also been this leakage into spying on U.S. corporations as well. So, I think this is likely to be a pretty large and intractable issue in the bilateral relationship between the U.S. and China for quite a number of years.
Daniel Alcovre from Itaú BBA. Thank you for the presentation, Arthur, very enlightening. I was wondering if you could explore a little bit the theme of the new commanders of China and the Chinese party, how much prepared they are to face the new challenges, how much they are pacified after the recent events, including Bolshoi and all the presidents that happened in this transition. So how much, on the political point of view, how much prepared China is for the couple next years?
Good question, and I wish I knew the answer. China does not have a very open political system, so most of what we say about the political leaders is, there's a lot of guesswork in it. I think the general observation that I would make is that the quality of high-level officials in China is extremely high. I mean, you cannot get to the top levels of government unless you have demonstrated a very high degree of competence in what you do. The second observation is that they have a very good system for making sure that people retire. So there's a fairly strict set of retirement ages which max out at 70, but for lower levels of officials at 65 or even 60. So you never get stuck with the same guys for too long, which has been a problem in places like Italy and Japan, where even though you have a lot of rotation of governments, it's the same guys over and over and over again until they're 80 or 90. And that doesn't happen in China. So I think institutionally, although China's political system is very closed, it's actually very effective at making sure that the leadership is responsive to changes in the economy. The other thing is that it's very difficult to get to the top of the political system unless you have served time as an administrator at some kind of provincial level. So you can't just sit in Beijing for 50 years, getting more and more out of touch what's going on with the rest of the country, and become president. So Xi Jinping was the boss of 2 different provinces. Li Keqiang, I think, was the boss of 2 different provinces. Zhang Dejiang was the boss of Guangdong province. Yu Zhengshan was the boss of Shanghai, and you go down the list. So every one of these people has had significant experience operating outside the capital, closer to the grassroots. So I think, broadly speaking, the other thing is that there's very few of these people who were trained as engineers. A lot of the past leadership of China has been engineers, and so whenever you had a problem, their solution was, well, let's build something, right? And you don't need to build anymore. China has plenty of buildings. You need to manage things. So these are people who don't have a building mentality, they have more of a management mentality, and that's an improvement, okay? So I think in a lot of ways, I think these guys are better prepared. They're a little bit more economically literate than the people they replace. And I think the evidence is that they're slightly less corrupt than the previous group, which is also a good thing. And there are fewer of them, which is also a good thing. So I think broadly speaking, we're pretty comfortable with it. But the other thing I think that's worth noting is that the way that the top leadership is set up is that typically on